Hello, friends, and welcome to the Collective Awakening podcast. We are live and in living person of people, and myself and Steven, and we're joined by another Steven as well, very good friend of ours, Steven Greer.
Hello.
We have done an episode previously with you, which I really encourage people to check out. But we've come together in person finally.
Yeah, finally.
So it'd be a good place to start, Steven. Just we may be introducing a little bit about yourself. And how you would put the many different facets of what you do in order. I'm going to let you do that introduction.
Where do I start? Well, if you're thinking spiritually, my experiences started when I was very small. I had the voice of a lady around me from when I was very young. I think the first time I heard her voice, I was about 4 years old, something like that. And it was a young female voice. I would say the feeling would be of a young woman of, say, 25, something like that, that came literally out of the center of the room where I was. So if I was at home, say, sat on the sofa over there, the sound of the woman would come from the center of the room, which would be right there. And she would say things to me like, "You are loved," or "I love you," or something like that. And I always found it incredibly comforting because of the circumstances I was growing up in. It was the only thing really that made me feel properly safe, because in my waking life and in my dreaming life, and interestingly, I've never really seen much distinction between waking and dreaming, because to me they're both different aspects of the same thing. So when I'm asleep, I'm still very much me, and when I'm awake, I'm the same person I am when I'm asleep. So I've never really seen much distinction between the two. But my waking life and my dreaming life were both incredibly intense and actually very abusive. My adoptive family were they had bad circumstances, which it's not appropriate to go into here, but that fed into the way I was treated. And when I was asleep, I was being pursued by things that I much later realized were energies that were around my adoptive parents, if you understand what I mean. Yeah. So I was being pursued by those energies when I was asleep, as well as kind of in waking life when I was awake.
Would that be a little bit like nightmares? Or?
Oh God, yes. I mean, Tiana would tell you that even after we got together, when I completely split from my family, those nightmares continued for the next 25 years, and they only disappeared completely. And I didn't know this at all at the time, but they disappeared completely on what turned out to be the night my adoptive mother passed away. Wow. And I only found out about her passing away several days later, when my dreams had suddenly become perfectly normal. And it was like, oh, I could get used to this. And then I found out that she'd passed away on the day that those nightmares stopped. So, like I say, the energies that were around them were sort of pursuing me. So the unseen female voice that said to me, "I love you," or "You are loved," was the thing that made me feel safe.
Yeah, it's almost like an anchor coming in.
Yes. Yeah, she was my anchor, yes. And occasionally I would dream about a ballerina who looked like Odette in Swan Lake, if you know who I'm talking about, the main character in Swan Lake. And she would be there under a tree on point, holding out her hand to me like that. And I would go and take her hand. And at the moment I took her hand, again, I felt completely safe and loved.
This is in your dream?
Yes. So that feeling of love coming from her, and it was obvious that the dancer was the same person who was saying, "I love you." Yeah. She was like a guardian to me, I suppose, helping me through what I was going through. And I think that was what started also my real proper interest in music, classical music, was through the ballet and through the music for Swan Lake and the Nutcracker, with the other Tchaikovsky very well-known ballet, which is where it started. And when I listened to that music, I felt safe, like I did when I was with her. It was, or when I heard her voice, it was the same feeling of love, of protection, of safety. And my interest in classical music really just unfolded from there. So did
you end up finding out who she was then later on in life? Is she some kind of guide? Is she a past life connection?
There is a past life connection, yes.
Do you want to share that a little bit?
No, no. No. There are some things that I would like to keep private, and it's not for any odd reason. It's just that. It's not that I don't think it's relevant, because it kind of is, but she is a character from my past life.
Yeah. And
she's Russian, which makes perfect sense given where my past lives go. Because my past lives have been very involved with, Imperial Russia going back into the 19th century. So that makes a lot of sense. But, as to who she is, I'll keep that to myself. But it was that feeling of love and that feeling of safety and joy as well. And it gave me a joy that I just didn't have in waking life. So the music for me, the ballet music to start with, and then everything else that unfolded from that, was a way of connecting to her and a way of connecting to that feeling of love and connection, which I felt was very important for me. But I feel very much that it's very important for everyone else as well.
A lot of people listening there, it's because a lot of people would very much be resonating with, who've had difficult childhoods. And what was the point you came to? Obviously, you got that anchor, that lovely experience that was just letting you know you are loved, you're not on your own.
Yes.
Which I'm sure, our listeners might have experienced or would have as well.
Yes.
What was the point where you started to piece together why you'd chosen that experience, almost the reincarnation? Do you know, because we all have these experiences where we're looking at the time, they feel absolutely horrible. Why? And then later we start to put the pieces together and we could understand.
Well, there's a book that I'm going to go into that. But there's a book that I would recommend that people read of a young woman who had a similar experience to mine, but in a different context. And it's a book called And the Wolves Howled by Barbro Carlén. Barbro Carlén is a well-known Swedish poet. She was a young woman, very, very well known at a very early age. And she had these kind of similar experiences to me, but in a different context. And she pieced together her past life and began to understand why she was going through all the frankly rubbish, I'm not going to say the word, that she was going through. Now, in my case, it was similar, but the context was different. I had a recurring game that I used to play when I was a child, when I was at primary school, where I was escaping from a house. And I was trying to escape from a house, and the house was surrounded by guards. And I had to get out of the house, and I was running for an aircraft. And the guards would throw bombs at me as I was running away. And eventually I would be rescued by this very kindly young chap who I was called John. And yet I would be injured while I was escaping. And I obsessively played this game from when I was about 4 years old to when I was about 6 or 7. And eventually I came to realize that that game was not a game. It was a memory. And it was a memory of something that had happened to me. I won't tell you exactly when, but I came to understand that it was during the First World War. And it was a memory of an experience that I'd had. And the guards were people who I knew in this life now, if you understand what I mean. And they were antagonists of mine in the past. But I had done something that had got one of them killed. And eventually, and I've written about this in my book, which I talked to you about the other day, but one of the things that I came to realize was that I had felt responsible for the death of that person. And these things really hurt me, that I would be responsible for somebody's passing. And it was like I felt I had a responsibility to help them where they were now. The problem was, which I didn't realize later, but I realized the dynamic that I was talking about before in my adoptive family, that dynamic and the way my adoptive parents treated me came directly out of that experience in the First World War, which kind of we were repeating, if you understand what I mean. And the unconscious feelings that particularly my adoptive mother had towards me, I much later realized she was unconsciously reacting to me in the way the person who died in the First World War would have. It's like, how dare you do this to me? Do you know what I mean? There was this dislike of me that she had. And the way she treated me came out of that. And I realized it was because of that experience that I was trying to help heal, if you understand what I mean. And I was there to help them heal that experience and also to help them be themselves as well, because in that life, they were trapped in fear as much as I was, at the time. And it was to help them blossom out into who they could be in this life. But unfortunately, as things work out, the dynamic didn't really work, and they kind of stayed stuck where they were, and there was nothing I could do in the end. And one of my big lessons was to learn that people can only change when they are ready to.
Oh, absolutely.
That was the biggest lesson I learned.
I think a lot of us have been through that passage in this life.
People can only change when they are ready to. And no matter what you say to them, what direction you point them in. And in fact, one of my first experiences with somebody in spirit talking to me was the young woman. She was talking to me again, and she said, you can drag your mother down the road with you and you are convinced that this is where she should be going. She said, but trust me, if you let go of her now, she will run right back to where she was to start with, spitting at you as she goes, because she's not ready to come down the road with you.
Yeah.
You have to let this go. In other words, the attempt at healing was a good one. The intention was good, but the person wasn't ready. Yeah. So I realized I had to let it go, and that's when my life started to change.
Is that when you had to let your mum go? Did you say?
Yeah. I had to let her go at that point. There was nothing I could do, and so I realized if I stayed, it was probably going to result in my death ultimately, the way things were going. And it was like, no, I didn't stay here to just disappear like this. I came here with a wider thing to do.
Maybe the lesson was for your mum to understand the consequences of not wanting to change. That
I think so,
and that maybe that was the lesson that you ultimately had to come to learn, is to say, I'm stepping away from that. We can't continue this karmic wheel.
Exactly.
I have to break this now. You can still continue on your path.
Yeah.
And I think anybody listening to the podcast will resonate that in all our families in some ways and it's not a failure. It's not a failure having to let go. It's part of that healing and the consequences of that healing as well.
You're absolutely right, Stephen. And what's being said there is there can be a pattern of where if we feel something's meant to be, or there is a connection, that we have to see it through. And I think many of us have experienced, I know I've experienced that where, and I've come to learn in helping others in any way, it should never come at a cost to us. energetically or physically, mentally. If it does, it is time to make that break. But I know you're very big on it, Steve, when you mention it's not about punishing people, but actions have consequences. We all choose. We choose left or right. We were discussing it last night, funny, in a question you got at a demonstration.
Choice.
And people say, well, how can people do things? Well, we choose all the time. We're choosing every day, left, right.
Yeah.
Which way do we want to go?
Exactly.
But I just want to ask you a question a little bit as we're sort of opening up the podcast here, which is really fascinating. Is I know you didn't, which I respect about not touching too much about the past life stuff, because I think sometimes people can get entrapped.
They can get stuck in it.
And they romanticize the past life side.
Yeah, well. Over-romanticize it too. Yes.
It. But how useful has that remembrance been? As obviously, I firmly believe that your soul will recall those parts for a reason. And has that been an important component, part of your self-healing in that remembrance journey?
Yeah, very definitely, because I firmly believe that that past lives are useful because they teach you where you've been, and knowing where you're going is impossible if you don't know where you've been. So in other words, one of the main things that I'll touch on a past life again. In one of my past lives, I had a career dichotomy because I was a scientist and a composer at the same time. And I had these two worlds running parallel to each other. And I was trying to make a success of both of them at the same time. And I had to choose one or the other. And I refused to. And in refusing to, it led to my death in that life, because I was trying so hard to make a success of both that my energy just literally exploded. And in this life, I faced exactly the same dichotomy again. I went into the same profession again as a scientist, and not only a scientist, it was exactly the same kind of science. It was analytical chemistry. I was an analytical chemist, and this was the same thing that I'd been 140 years earlier, where I'd had this thing about being a composer at the same time as being a chemist. And I had to make a choice again as to which one I would do. This time, I chose music ultimately as the way I would go over the chemistry. But I had a warning in this life about the consequences of trying to run the two in parallel again, because when I was 21 years old, I had a stroke. When I was in the middle of doing my first PhD in chemical engineering, and that stroke, I realized fairly swiftly, was a warning about me trying to basically live two lives at once again. So it was like, if you keep this up, you know, you passed away in that life because of this problem, you're going to pass away again with the problem not healed. So make your choice. And the reason I didn't make the choice previously, going back 140 years or so, is because I was a composer who got music. I wasn't trained at an academy or a conservatoire. I just did it. And I felt that because I hadn't had the training, the academic training, I felt inadequate. And I felt that my music was worthless because I didn't have the qualification, the paper qualifications behind me.
Yeah, like an imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I felt like a fool. I felt like a fraud. I felt, I genuinely felt like a fraud. And no matter what, I mean, I have memories of the people around me saying, "Oh, your work's really good," and I'm going, "No, it's not." It's like, "Oh no, I could do better than this," and I hadn't had the training, so what's the point, And this life, it was the same. So I felt as though this time I had to pursue the academic qualifications in my chosen field in order to feel that I was adequate in my field, if you understand what I mean. So
But also you come to realise that maybe now with your spiritual understanding that you've maybe perhaps learned that maybe you didn't need that to feel that, because you're already, the gift within you, isn't it?
I'm starting to realise that now, actually.
But again, understanding that we take that path for a reason.
Yeah, we do.
Learn the other way.
We do.
Talked about my experience about, past life, drinking too much, and me being very, we have to see on the other foot as well to understand both journeys.
And it's fascinating, actually, with me now seeing the musical academic world, which I am doing now, and realising that actually, oddly, I was right all the time. Do you know what I mean? I'm sort of looking at it and going, this is interesting. And I'm really enjoying it. I mean, don't get it twisted. I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. But I also, at the same time, have realized that the past version of me was actually right in the first place, which has made me chuckle, because it's like I want to go back and talk to my previous self now and go, you know what? You've no business feeling inadequate. You're right. Go with how you feel.
What's coming to my mind. I'm sort of picturing in my imagination that past lives, in particular, sort of listening to you, Stephen, which is absolutely fascinating. That I call it like soul retrieval. We've come back in this incarnation to realign aspects of our past that needs, like a jigsaw piece, that needs to fit back together. So you're remembering those aspects. And it's almost like, but you've written your contract extra hard for me. Yeah. And it's like, I need to sort this out, I need to sort this out, I need to sort this out. Yeah. And it's like you're coming in with all this stuff that you want to sort. Yeah. But it's a testament to your strength of your soul.
Yeah, like with many of us, even if you were to go back to yourself at that certain point where there was doubt, you wouldn't be who you are now.
No.
It's part of the journey.
No, it is. And I've realised this also, in that one of the analogies I draw when I talk to people about this now is that your incarnations, and we're talking about past lives here, the Einstein will probably tell you that everything's happening at once. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And he's right. Looked at from the point of view of present day physics research and consciousness research, even today's scientists are starting to come to the conclusion that everything's happening at once. That being the case, all of your incarnations are actually living their lives at the same time. Yeah. So the way I look at it now is it's like, and it's funny, we were talking about Star Trek and Star Wars earlier on. Well, I'll give you another one, and it's Doctor Who.
Oh, I love Doctor Who.
And Doctor Who has had it right since 1966, when they did the first regeneration of William Hartnell into Patrick Troughton. Because the whole point about these past lives they are like the incarnations of the Doctor. So each time you come back as literally as a different person, because you are. But inside, you're not.
You're still the same.
You're still the same person you were before. But you are older. So it's like you just said about me going back and talking to my past self. That's a little bit like the 15th Doctor going to talk to the 12th Doctor. Yeah. So the 12th Doctor is younger than the 15th.
Good analogy there. Yeah.
But the 15th knows more. It's the same person, but the 15th Doctor knows more than the 12th Doctor does. So because he's had the extra experience and has healed himself, presumably, of some of the problems the 12th Doctor had, he can then hopefully give the 12th Doctor that perspective that he didn't have. And that's the way I look at it. I would... So in a way, I would quite like to have all the different versions of me in the, like sometimes happens in the Doctors, because you get the 3 Doctors or the 5 Doctors. And I always think that would be quite good fun for me to talk to, say, the young woman who was alive in the First World War, which is an earlier version of me. And it's like, she's me, but not, because I've had extra experience, which she hasn't had. So I would love to go and talk to her and give her the benefit of the experiences that I've had. It will be interesting.
Wow, amazing. So I think it's really fascinating, the past life. So is any advice advisement you can give people that are listening to this podcast today regarding an interest in their past life? Because in my opinion, that it should be a very natural, organic process. The recall, the remembrance, the synchronicities unravels at that right point for people. But I think curiosity is also a quality I think we as humans need to tap into a little bit more.
Agreed.
That curious. But what advisement, through your experience, sometimes there is that fear of over-attachment to the past life.
That's one thing I would say people mustn't do, and that is get over-attached. Yeah. Because realize, I mean, quite often I know in my case, I find that at least 2 of my lifetimes have been quite well-known people, but the other lives haven't been well-known people at all. You know, they're just, I mean, one life I had in the 17th century was a lifetime as a captain in the in Charles I's army in the Civil War, but nobody knows who he was now. Do you understand what I mean? I'm just aware that I was a captain in his army during the Civil War, and while it's fascinating sometimes, if you find that you had an incarnation of a person that was well-known or reasonably well-known to history, there is a temptation in that to get attached to that person because of the glamour of it, right? You mustn't do that, because every life has its worth. No matter whether it's a person digging fields or a duke, it doesn't matter. You're still you. It doesn't matter whether you're the duke in the castle with loads of servants or whether you're the dude in the fields digging the trenches. You're still you, and it's the learning that's the most important thing, not the glamour of who you have been. That's pointless. The only point there is to it, and I've thought about this with respect to the 2 lives I do know, the point about it is to get to the bottom of what those lives were about. And that's beyond the glamour. And this is what you're saying about being curious. And the way you do it is, and very early on when I was thinking about past lives, I was thinking, logically, and this was before I was, in any way spiritual or involved in spiritualism at all. So this was when I was in my teens. I was thinking, I'd read about past lives. I've forgotten where I'd read it now. I think it might have been in one of Michael Bentine's books. And I started getting into spiritualism and things like that through Michael Bentine's books. And I think he might have mentioned past lives, but he was mentioning how you would get in touch with those. And the way he talked about it was, think about what your interests are. What are you drawn to? What do you love? What time periods are you drawn to? Because I might be drawn to, take the English Civil War or the 100 Years' War or the time of Joan of Arc or something like that, right? That resonates with me very strongly. Whereas other time periods, which I look at, like, say, the reign of Edward I or the time of Alfred the Great, doesn't do anything for me. So his take on it was, obviously, the things you feel passionate about or the things you feel passionately drawn to, that's where you were. Yeah. So begin your exploration, your curiosity, begin your exploration with that consciousness. That it's what you love, it's what you're drawn to that tells you where you were. And it's your loves that are your pathway through time.
That's so interesting, that. I don't know why it's just come into my head. I remember when I was about 7, 8, I was very, very close to my great aunt, my granddad's sister in Germany. And they lived in Langhagen, which is in Hanover. And she used to travel. She used to love coach trips, German coach trips, to go to Scotland. And she had books on books, and I'd what was Bonnie Prince
Charlie?
And she was so fascinated, and she believed she lived during that period in Scotland.
Yeah,
and I don't know why that memory just come back now. Maybe spirit drawing close, and she was so fascinated with that. And I remember even with myself, two things. I was always fascinated with Egypt, ancient Egypt. And then there was this thing of in the Aztecs in South America, feeling I liked it, but also frightened me.
Yeah.
It scared
understandably.
me. But then when I went to Mexico, I didn't like, nothing to do with the country. I didn't like being here. So it triggered in me this feeling of I don't like being here. But now I've come to understand that I was killed a couple of times. My heart was taken, ripped out. So it triggered that I had to. And it's interesting how a lot of our work has a lot of South American influence in our shamanic work. Yeah.
It will do. And think about what we were talking about off camera before, where you were talking about that quote unquote mark that you brought with you.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the same thing. Yeah. We're talking about a past life thing, energy that you've brought with you that has somehow played itself out in scenarios that you've experienced yourself.
Yeah.
And you find, and like I was saying about me, you know, here's me doing nothing but standing on a train station platform, minding my own business. And people come up to me and start, you know, young men start coming up to me and saying, oh, it's like, I'm one of the aristocracy, or I'm at Eton College, or whatever. It's an energy that they're picking up in me from the past.
Yeah.
That's playing out in real time in front of you.
Absolutely. And even with the different places and countries, you talk to most people and they're very, very drawn, or somewhere they'd like to go, or I must go there in my life. And then other points, I would never go there. So also there could be something there. That maybe it was a life that it wasn't so good that they're not ready to revisit as well.
And that's part of the shadow work that everyone talks about, because the thing that you suppress, if you do suppress it, it'll start coming back. You'll start seeing it in front of you.
Coming up more.
It'll start playing out in front of you, and every time you sort of do the Dracula sign to try and get rid of it, the more it's going to come back up.
Resistment is actually what brings it closer.
Yes,
like
exactly.
What you're seeking is seeking you. When you were saying about that mark, I don't know why memory come back, and it's something Billy Connolly said once, and he said, I could wear, you know, since I've become famous or such, he said, I could wear the nicest suit and the nicest clothes, but there's something about me that just says nothing. I don't have much. I'm poor. And he was a bit of a comedy. But looking back, it's a similar thing.
It's an energy he's carrying with him.
Essence that we carry with us, which is really interesting. Because I'm sure a lot of people listening will be able to understand, you know, what you said there, Stephen, about this. Well, I've had these scenarios in my life playing out, and that isn't what I look like. That isn't who I am. It's totally out of context. And we begin to make sense. That's why, for me, reincarnation brings so much clarity. It can put things into such perspective. And it can take us out of thoughts being the victim.
Yes.
And thought, oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
So I can stand back and see the whole picture.
It's stopping and being curious. I mean, just what come to my mind again is when we did the podcast with Rob Tweedy, and he mentioned about Avery with you, Chris, that you had a past life there, that you did some kind of astrology work and people didn't like it. You were a bit revolutionary with your ideas and they tried to suppress you. And it's almost like then a few months later, we visited Avery, didn't we, together? But for energetically, you had to go there. Didn't you? Did you feel that?
Well, absolutely. And it's two things are interesting about that is one, after we'd been, there was like this big opening in my spiritual work after. It was like a door had opened, and I was getting loads of people getting in contact.
They did, didn't they?
But also what comes to mind is, and I've thought about this often, people who are quite revolutionary figures or will come up with something that's a new idea, very rarely is it welcomed. It's normally 10 years down the line, somebody they got it right. But at the time, you would find that person got a lot of stick.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I found this in classical music. There was a composer called Arnold Schoenberg who in the early 1900s expanded what is generally thought of as classical tonality to a point where things were getting very dissonant, very discordant. And he felt that it was a natural evolution of what Beethoven and Mozart had been doing before him. But he was ridiculed. He was told he was wrong. He couldn't get academic positions. He couldn't get to teach where he wanted to teach. He had to, teach his pupils off his own bat, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
And his ideas were not accepted at all until after the Second World War. And then, this was when he was in his late old age, really, by the time things started to turn round for him. But even then, he insisted that people were getting his ideas wrong. They weren't understanding exactly what he was driving at. And it took really until the Finnish composer Rautavaara came along in the late 1960s, well after Schoenberg had passed away, for people to suddenly realize, oh, that's what he was driving at. Do you understand what I mean? So it was the same thing. And the poor guy was ridiculed in his lifetime, and his life was made very, very sad. And he actually wrote an awful essay, an awfully sad essay called How One Becomes Lonely, which was about his experience of doing this revolutionary thing that nobody liked.
You can almost find yourself in the role as the black sheep.
Yeah.
A little bit of a way, But
exactly.
But I think it's part of the process, though.
Yeah, and then coming back to reincarnation, probably we would have been advised, this is going to be quite tough for you.
Yes.
You're going to come in and shake things up.
Well, I was told before I came here, my very first memory is a pre-incarnational memory of talking to a very beautiful woman, and she's saying to me, look, you don't have to go back to Earth. You don't have to. You don't have to do this. You can if you want to, but you can stay here with us. You can evolve with us from here. You don't have to go back to Earth to do what you're wanting to do. And she was trying to persuade me to stay where I was, because she said the path you've chosen will be very, very difficult. She said, are you aware of how difficult this is going to be?
Yeah.
And of course, with the bravado of being on the other side and knowing that everything is fine, Big Mouth here said, oh, it's fine. I can handle it. I can
Curiosity.
do it. I can do it. And the number of times in the life I've lived now where I have regretted that statement, because over there, everything's fine. You're in bliss, you're in love, you're surrounded by safety. There is no problem at all. And of course, when you're there, you completely lose touch with exactly how it is here. And then when you get here, you think, oh no, I should not have said that, And so I've had a number of times where I've kind of gone, you know what, she was right. I should have stayed there. But actually, no, I'm glad I did come, because what I've learned, my growth, and the loves that I've had, and the love I have of music and of ballet, I wouldn't be without it. I wouldn't be without any of it.
What comes across with you as well is not only in combination with that, life experiences a very strong anchoring in your, some said knowing, belief, in the spirit world, in consciousness as well. That seems a big driving force. That when you speak to somebody, they just know. Yeah, and that feels like a very strong.
The experiences force I've had. I mean, even as a scientist, which is how I look at it, because, I grew up with science and I was a science PhD twice before the mid-1990s. I mean, the way I look at it, I don't believe anything unless I can ground it scientifically. And I know I've grounded it scientifically. So it's not a belief, it's knowing. It goes way beyond belief.
Just wearing the conversation a little bit, because I want to touch on a little bit about your mediumship. How did you get into the mediumship side, and how important is that being part of your divine purpose?
Yes.
As well.
Oh yes, yes, very definitely. The mediumship thing, I guess I realized when I when I eventually started doing it, which was back in, 2010, I think it was, when I actually finally started doing it. But I realized when I finally started doing it that I'd actually been doing mediumistic things for most of my life without realizing I was doing it. Because the number of times I'd had precognitive dreams, for example, that came true. I mean, the most striking example was my adoptive father's first epileptic fit. I had a precognitive dream about it. I knew exactly where it was going to happen. I didn't know when, because when you have these precognitive dreams, you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. Yeah. You just know that it is. And I saw him in the place where it was going to happen, how it was going to happen. And then when it finally did happen, I went, oh my goodness. You know what I mean? Yeah. It was like, I actually literally saw this before it happened. And that happened any number of times when I was growing up, when I was in my teens, when I was in my 20s. Actually doing, I used to really spook my adoptive mother as well by voicing thoughts that were in her head before she'd actually opened her mouth and said them. She used to get a bit scared of that, because I'd say something and she'd turn to me and she'd go, I was about to say that. That was how did you know that? That was in my head. And I was just, I don't know. It was just sort of there. And I felt as though I had to say it. And also, I only realized fairly recently that this was another example of it. And it was my maths teacher when I was at primary school would set us maths problems. And I would just see the solution in my head. And it's like, yeah, that's the solution. And I'd write it on the board and he'd go, where's your working out? I said, there isn't any. I said, that's the solution to the problem. And he put me at the back of the maths class and said I was backward because I wouldn't show me working out. But I wouldn't show me working out because the solution literally just popped into my head out of nowhere. And I did that later on when I was doing advanced mathematics when I was at university. And I was doing an advanced maths course with respect to doing quantum mechanics, which I was doing in my second year at university. And I had to do an A-level maths course because I hadn't done maths A-level. And the same thing happened again. And I would be seeing a complicated maths problem in front of me, and the solution would just come into my head. And I just write it down. Now, this time, unlike when I was at school, we had the exam at the end of the course, and the exam was a 3-hour exam. I did the exam in 15 minutes because I literally just wrote all the answers down. Wow. And then I said to the invigilator, I said, I've finished. Can I leave, or do I sit here twiddling my thumbs for the next 2.25 hours? Wow. And so the invigilator let me leave, and it came back. I got 100% in the exam, and that had never happened before. So that was an example, kind of this sort of thing happening. But getting into mediumship itself, it was Tiana that was responsible for it, really, because Tiana was interested in, we were living in Somerset at the time, and Tiana was interested in going to see a medium at Bath First Spiritualist Church, which was an SNU church. And so we went to the church, sat in the audience, and poor Tiana, she was the one wanting the message. I was the one who got one. And the medium said to me, you're going to be stood here, you're going to be doing this. And said one or two other things which were quite prescient in terms of my adoptive family and things like that. The medium picked them up very well. And we were driving home, and I said, and I quote, that was the biggest pile of, no, I'm not going to say the word, expletive, deleted, whatever. That was the biggest pile of what's it that I've ever heard in my life. There is no way, and I said this, there is no way in hell that you are getting me up on a stage to do what he was doing today. That is the biggest load of rubbish I have ever heard in my life. And it was like, no, I am not doing this. No way. Not even touching it. So anyway, we went to Bridgewater Spiritualist Church a little while later, and it was very nice, and nice atmosphere, and the president was lovely, and he was giving the mediumship that night. And the president, a lovely guy called Norman Scott, who is he's Romany background. We were leaving, and Norman came up to us, and he looked at me, and he said, "You're a medium." He just pointed at me, and he said, "You're a medium." He said, "You'll be doing what I'm doing sometime." He said, "I want you to come to the circle." He said, "We have a circle on Tuesday. Will you come to the circle?" And I thought, well, I've been kind of backed into a corner here. I really can't do anything about this. So I said, well, yeah, okay. I mean, I like Norman and I like the church, so it was great. And I thought, yeah, why not? We'll go. And so we went to the circle. And when we were in the circle, we just started doing sort of visualization exercises. You were talking about the imagination.
Yeah.
Well, we were just sort of doing visualization exercises. And I started getting messages for people through my imagination. I would see things, and I would see people, because I have quite a visual imagination. So, if I'm getting something, I will literally see a scenario in my head, and it will start playing out. That's how it works. Norman explained it to me later as to, this business of the imagination being the interface, and it's like, that's how they kind of work. And I was starting to get stuff, and I got stuff pretty quickly and pretty in detail as well. And I didn't get names, but I got scenarios, and I got feelings, and I got people, and I saw things moving. And Norman was like, wow, this guy's really good. And within, was it 4 weeks? Was it 4 weeks? Yeah, 4 weeks. Within 4 weeks of going to the circle, he was actually taking me on his, on his rounds, doing services. And he would do part of the service, and I would do part of the service. And that was how it started. So that was literally within 4 weeks of me going to the circle. That was how it started. And I've been doing services ever since. So that's how I got into it. There was also a trance circle there, which Norman ran, and Norman channels various people. He's channeled Arthur Conan Doyle before now. And people have seen him channel Arthur Conan Doyle, and it's very impressive. And Norman was quite convinced that I could do trance channeling as well. So he sat us down and got us into the zone. And so I've done trance channeling as well, and I've channeled some quite interesting people over time. Yeah.
It's another aspect of mediumship that is not really talked about, is it? Trance.
Yeah. And we were talking about it the show before the show. We were having a little catch up earlier about the many varying parts of mediumship that you don't always hear about.
No.
Trance is one of those, but what's lovely to hear is your journey, like many others really, is very natural. That's what's really, I can remember people saying to Steven, you used to get that a lot in churches, you're going to be stood up here, and you did the same. It's like, you must be kidding. Come on.
Yeah.
Those, but the proof's in the pudding, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think what you've experienced there is it's just come to you that many times, the same thing. That
yes.
There's something in it.
It was on repeat. It was literally on repeat. You couldn't get around it. And, in the end, I mean, the proof for me, again, as a scientist, sort of looking at it, the proof was in the fact that I was getting stuff for people in the circle that couldn't be got round.
Yeah.
And it was like, I'm obviously getting something here, and I can't get around this. It is working. There is no doubt,
What I'd really like to touch on is actually, we've touched on it a few bits when we were talking it before, is your sort of love of some of the, we talked about Doctor Who, Star Trek's been mentioned, Star Wars,
yeah,
and sort of that part that's played, that interest in the sci-fi, the adventurous side, because that's something you're really passionate about.
I am, and it's the scientist in me again. It's not just the scientist, but it's the part of me that realizes and that knows that there's something else.
Yeah.
And that the science and the spirituality is all linked. Yeah. It's all one. And a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, funnily enough, one of the things that cropped up when I was doing my MA in literature was I realized that there were sort of various interesting figures from the 19th century, like Sir Humphrey Davy, for instance, and also John Ruskin. And for them, there was no distinction between science and spirituality. They were the same thing. You know, it's like you were a geologist and you were interested in, like Ruskin was, you were a geologist and you were interested in the geology and the rock formations and things like that. But there was no distinction between that and believing that there was a higher power or a source that was beyond, that was creating all of this.
Absolutely.
And for them, everything was together. And I must admit, it's something that I've realized from my past lives, that I've had that consciousness as well. And I've come in again this time with that. I've carried it with me. And this feeling that there is no distinction between science and spirituality has been very strong. And that's what I love about things like Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, is that when you look at you know, say, for example, some of the alien species that are met in Star Trek particularly, you find that the alien species, or the non-human species, shall we say, have this, a lot of them have this integration between science and spirituality. And it felt to me as though that was something that Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was trying to get across, that it's like, this is a reality in the universe out there. And
I agree with you.
Yeah, he was obviously, to me, getting things that he was then, truths that he was then putting out to the public. And in Star Wars, the greatest truth of all is the Force. And everyone jokes about it, but it's not. It is a joke, but it's also not funny, because the Force is real. George Lucas was right. And the Force is real. It is Yoda describes the Force, I think in Empire Strikes Back, when he's tutoring Luke, he goes, the Force is in everything and through everything. It binds us. It binds you and me and that statue over there. And that is why he would say to Luke, tune into the Force and lift that statue. Use the Force, lift that statue. Now, there are people on Earth who can do that, who are telekinetic, who can actually already do that. And my own belief is that kind of telekinetic ability, where we can literally tap into the Force, for want of a better phrase, in order to move physical objects, that's an ability we all have. We just don't all have the ability to tap into it, or we're not trained to do it. But it's there. It's latent.
It taps into the thought I've had for many years now, which is, we say seeing is believing, but I always switch those two around.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Believing is seeing, and really in that part with Luke and Yoda, he's learning to have faith in something that can't be seen or touched.
Yeah. The classic phrase that Yoda says to him, always with you, it cannot be done.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when Luke's trying to lift the fighter out of the swamp, and he starts doing it, but then his lack of belief in it kicks in, and you can see that, and it was like, oh, I can't do this, and then all of a sudden it goes back down. And then Yoda goes to him, well, you know, judge me by my size, do you? You know, think I can't do this because I'm tiny. It's like, watch this. And he just puts his hand out and up he comes and across and down. And Luke said, the classic line is, Luke says to him, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
And Yoda goes, that is why you fail.
Yeah, and I think that it's a very good example how nothing is limiting us, we limit ourselves in placing ceilings there that really don't, where we are limitless. We are really limitless beings.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things we have to learn is how limitless we really are.
Yeah. Definitely in this time, and I know we call it Podcast Collective Awakening, but this time we're in now is about expanding that as well.
Yeah.
But something I'd like to touch on, which is we could do a whole nother podcast on your knowledge of music.
Yeah.
We really could.
Yeah.
But what I want to touch on is in how music can make us feel.
Oh, wow.
When we talk about emotion.
Yeah.
And how it can make us feel one way or another.
This has to be handled very carefully.
Yeah.
Very carefully. Because I'll give you an instance. I know some of my academic colleagues will probably roll their eyes when I do this. The first performance of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring in 1913, which is infamous. That first performance caused a physical riot. It caused people to start punching each other out, and people were arrested, people were injured. You know what I mean? Yeah. It was a real riot, which spread out. I think I'm right in saying it spread out onto the streets of Paris. It might not have spread out onto the streets of Paris, but that's the legend, I think. The point being, the music had affected people in such a way that it made them angry and violent. This is why you've got to be careful with music, because I keep hearing these days people talking about everything is vibration, right? They don't realize how true they're being, because I'm jumping now. This is what I do. I get accused of jumping and talking of tangents, but you'll understand why when I sort of get to the point. Many years ago, there was an American couple who had lost their son. He had blown his brains out, and it was an awful case. He basically killed himself, and basically they had discovered that he was listening on repeat. I think this is right, but he certainly listened to it at least once, to a song by Ozzy Osbourne called Suicide Solution. Right? You can imagine what someone who is in a suicidal mindset, who listens to a song like that, he's resonating, obviously, with the song to start with. But so that's why he's attracted to it, because of what it's saying. But then the power of the music itself, the emotional power of the music, makes the whole thing worse. And it's like, oh, it's the only solution. It's the only way out. And this is what his parents were saying in the court case, that their son had got the idea that really this literally was the only way out for him. And the song had kind of made it that he would be in the mindset where he would then do that to himself. Yeah. So also the other thing is that it can go the other way, because say, for example, you go to a concert of early music played on original instruments, music by, say, Bach or Handel or something like that, played on original instruments, played at the A pitch that they were using at the time, which is about A430, which is close to 432, which I know is something else we might talk about at some point. But if you go to a concert like that, the feeling is so uplifting. You feel like you've literally walked into heaven. And again, that's the power of the music. That's what it's doing. So where emotions are concerned, with music, you have to be incredibly careful. There was a performance of, I think it was the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra years ago, of the Swedish composer Alan Pettersson's Symphony No. 8, which was written in 1967 or 68, I think. Alan Pettersson's work is powerful, but it is very depressing. And some wag in the Baltimore press after the first performance of this piece went, I didn't want to go to this concert and then feel as though I wanted to jump off the Baltimore Bridge afterwards, but I did after listening to that symphony. You see my point.
Yes.
You've got to be very careful. And many years ago, the composer Richard Strauss, who was he's one of my favorite composers, wrote beautiful, joyful, uplifting, heart-easing music. Now, in 1905 and 1907, between 1905 and 1907, he wrote 2 operas, one called Salome and the other one called Electra. And Salome is basically the story of John the Baptist, Salome, and the Dance of the Seven Veils. And Salome demands John the Baptist's head and all of this. Oscar Wilde wrote a play about it, and Strauss set the play to music. It is lurid. It is sexy, but in a bad way, if you know what I mean. It's the use of sexuality in the reverse sense to the way it should be used, if you know what I mean, for awfulness, for badness, for all of that. And then Electra is basically is taken from, I think, a Sophocles play, which is about Electra who takes revenge on her mother who has murdered her father, and Electra basically winds up goading her brother to murder her mother. You see where I'm going with this? It was all incredibly dark. And Strauss took the music to the edge of madness, essentially. Now, after that, he did a 180. And his next opera, Der Rosenkavalier, is basically updated Mozart. And that's where he spent the rest of his life. In other words, he didn't say this, but you look at it and you realize what happened. He looked into the abyss, even channeled the abyss in the music, then realized, no, I'm not going there. And not only that, my audience isn't going there either, and I'm going to make sure they don't by writing beautiful, uplifting, harmonious music for the rest of his life. Now, the confrontation he had with Arnold Schoenberg, who I mentioned earlier, Schoenberg presented Strauss, and Strauss has been a supporter of Schoenberg's for a long time, up to this point. Schoenberg presented him with his new work, his 5 pieces for orchestra, Opus 16. And they are pieces that take music over the edge. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like the Strauss work, only worse, if you understand what I'm getting at. And Strauss looked at the score, and you've probably heard of the composer Mahler, right? Well, his wife, Alma Mahler, was a good friend of Strauss's. And Strauss told Alma Mahler that, in his opinion, Schoenberg should stop trying to compose music, in his words, scribbling music notes on paper, and see a psychiatrist.
So what was he tapping into then? We talk about the sort of, not the dark side, the shadow side of music.
Yeah.
Is the composer, the musician, the writer of that music tapping into a frequency that is not very high then?
German Expressionism. It was German. It was part of German Expressionism in art. And it's a frequency that is all about horrors, nightmares, the shadow side of mankind coming out. It's filled with twisted imagery, very dark imagery, deaths, murders, suicides. You understand what I mean? It's all in there. Now, what Strauss was saying was, Schoenberg should not have been putting this on paper and then presenting it to an audience, because he's transmitting those feelings to the audience, and he's going to make the audience feel like that. And Strauss's idea was, look, have some mental hygiene, please. Go and sort your emotional problems out first with a psychiatrist, get that sorted out, and then get back to writing music again once you've got rid of it.
Do you see that with a lot of modern musicians as well? Because sometimes I find, and I don't know if you've experienced that, I don't know if you've experienced that, I'm thinking this song's making me feel really depressed.
Oh yeah.
It feels like there's a lot of, and it might be very controversial by saying that, there is a lot of projection in music
and
today.
that's what Strauss was complaining about with Schoenberg.
Yeah,
that he was projecting his own horrors on the audience. And again, this goes to what I was saying about Alan Peterson's Symphony No. 8 earlier on as well. It's like the extreme depression that the composer was suffering in his own life, which is very true, went into the music, and he was projecting that out on the audience, who were then absorbing it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And, you know, there is a case to be made, and a very good one, I think, for shadow work. We've talked about shadow work before, and shadow work is all about bringing up the stuff you don't want to look at, which comes up. Now, German Expressionism could be said to have done that on a collective level.
When did all that start?
Between about 1900 and about 1920, something like that.
So do you think with Germany going through this First and Second World, big components, do you think that was the start of a country shadow collective work? Do you think maybe the art and the music side?
And then the big shadow, of course, appeared in January 1933.
Yeah,
of course, we're not going to mention the name, of course, because you'll get kicked off YouTube.
I was very fascinated with that.
You mentioned the name. No.
Voldemort.
Actually, yes. But again, think about that. I'm sorry to jump.
Yeah.
But think about that. Why is it that they say we do not say his name? Yeah. Because if you do, you're bringing him in.
Yes.
It's a vibration.
Yeah.
You're bringing it, like you just said the H word, right? But people don't like that. And the reason they don't like it is precisely the same thing where we're talking about Voldemort.
Yeah.
If you say the H word, you're kind of bringing his vibration. You've got to be careful. You kind of bring in the vibration. Now, I know what you're going to say. I'm not going to say the word. H was fascinated with Wagner. Very true. And this is the problem that Jewish people, particularly, for good reason, have with Wagner. Because Wagner was incredibly anti-Semitic. Really incredible. I mean, his supporters will tell you, with good justification, that Germany, Austria, and parts of that part of Europe at the time, particularly artistically and in a wider sense, anti-Semitism was quite a thing at the time in those countries. It was endemic. Yeah. But just because it's endemic doesn't mean you have to go and make it worse. Do you understand what I mean? And Wagner, I'm sorry, he made it infinitely worse. And the problem is, what people don't we've talked about incarnations and things. Yeah. When you're living a life, what you don't realize is that sometimes things that actually, I'm sorry, I'm jumping again. Gladiator, do you remember Gladiator, right? What we do now echoes in eternity. Remember the line, right? Wagner, anti-Semitic words, horribly anti-Semitic writings, anti-Semitic caricatures in his operas. What he did then in the 1860s, 1870s, 1933 onwards, hello.
It all built up that self-prophecy that was created.
And the shadow just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
But also we come to understand as well as we're doing that inner work on ourselves that it is mirrored. Whatever was played out during that period was mirrored out to everybody's collective shadow.
Oh yes, it was part of Germany's collective shadow. This is what you were talking about.
And it was so fascinating because I'm half German, that how forward a lot of the German people were with the music side, the art side.
Yes.
During the Weimar Republic, with the music and the art that was very powerful, very forward thinking.
Yes, that's right.
And then maybe it was too soon before. Maybe it was too modern for a lot for that period.
You've got to. I mean, I've thought about this a lot myself in the research I've done, and you take a composer like Wilhelm Furtwängler, for example, who was a great conductor as well, and Furtwängler was criticized heavily for staying in Germany during the Nazi period. It turned out later that he helped an enormous number of people to escape, and he helped an enormous number of people to live and to avoid persecution. So he did a very good, in that sense, he did a very good job. But he felt, and he said this himself, he felt that it was his duty to stay and to project beauty into the world, the beauty of the music that he loved. So Beethoven, Mozart, Bruckner, Brahms, you know what I mean? He was anchoring, as far as he was concerned, he was anchoring that music there and making sure that it kept evolving, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
And the problem with the modern that you're talking about is that, and this brings me to one of my things. One of the issues that I have with what's called modern music is this idea of what was called the emancipation of the dissonance. The thought that a dissonance was only a more remote consonance. It's not. Dissonance is still dissonance. Do you see what I mean? And to include dissonance as extensively as the moderns began to, can you imagine, again, we were talking about how music makes people feel, right? How do you feel? Okay, I'll give you an example. You play a recording of Bach's Third Brandenburg Concerto, for example. How does that make people feel? Beautiful, uplifted, safe. Like I was talking about the music I loved earlier on. You play a piece of music that is filled with dissonances. How do you think that's going to make people feel?
Rubbish.
Worse than rubbish. It's going to make them feel really, really ill. And I had a conversation this many, many years ago now with a leading person in the then BBC, the BBC Philharmonic as it is now. And I won't say his name for various reasons, but he said to me that if the way the orchestra was set up was that they had to play what they were told to by the corporation, because it was all funded by the license fee payers and so on, and a particular editorial decisions were being made by the people who ran the orchestra. And so those editorial decisions meant that they had to play a lot of dissonant modern music. And he said to me, this keeps up. He said, I'm resigning. I said, why? He said, it's making me ill. He said, the music is literally making me physically ill. He said, it's making a lot of my colleagues physically ill as well. He said, we all feel the same way. He said, if this keeps up, we're not staying, we're leaving. And that's it. And that was the music was making people feel like that. And I've actually been at concerts where some of this kind of modern music is being played, and people are just getting up and walking out en masse. They're just leaving because they can't stand the way the music is making them feel.
I think it's very important, isn't it? The word, and it keeps coming this year to me all the time, be discerning. Because something I talk about quite often with people is a lot of people talk about clearing the home energy and such, and people go to sage and incense, which are all wonderful tools, not to dismiss them, but to me the greatest one is actually music.
Yes.
If you're feeling it's a bit low energy, maybe you've had a bit of a tough week, maybe you've had arguments in the home, anything like that, put some music on, something that you really gravitate to, and turn it up and get it, and it shifts energy very quick. So it's a wonderful, I don't want to say tool, it feels disrespectful, but it is. It's a wonderful tool, not only for us on our journey, but also for the environment around us. It can switch an environment like that. Yes. And that's what, even here with the work we do in our sound baths or one-to-one healing, the music plays a very, very important component.
Well, I could do this with you two as an experiment, right? I could send you two out the room and I'd have two pieces of music with me. One is a beautiful classical piece and one is a not so beautiful modern one, right? Mm. And I would play the pieces in here and then get you back in and ask you how you feel when you're standing in the room, which has just had that music playing in it. I bet you'd be able to identify which one was which.
That's a good experiment to do.
You know.
I use that next call. We do some of your music.
It's been absolutely amazing. I cannot believe the time that has passed, Stephen. But I'm so pleased.
It's been an hour and a half.
That we've been able to.
Good Lord.
The subjects we've been able to touch on, because it's such a wonderful natural flow, and I feel it'll be a lot that I know I can resonate with. Definitely. It's like the structures you mentioned of things, how they go, that you could place them in other parts of life. What you talked about with the music, you could fit that to books, to movies.
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
To anything that involves a process where it's being channeled.
Yeah.
Us as the channel, it's and how things can be projected.
Yeah, also beware of what you're opening to and beware of what you're channeling.
Yeah, always.
Always. Because this is where you've got to tune in to the highest, the most peaceful, the best. I was lucky when I was very small, when I had the young woman talking to me and then the ballerina coming to me, and she pointed me in the direction of Tchaikovsky's music right from the start. So I was incredibly lucky because I had that channeling type experience right from the beginning.
Yeah, be discerning. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For sharing your time with us. And
You're welcome.
Also, Tiana, you can't see us just off the camera as well. She's been our audience member. We're getting an audience building now, but it's been absolutely wonderful spending this time with you.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think we should do another one.
I would love to, because I think the topics we've opened up, we could go into them in a lot more depth. I would love to talk more about it.
Trilogy coming on.
Yeah,
definitely.
Next one being Return of the Jedi, maybe.
We'll stick Empire. Yes. So thanks so much, anybody, if you're listening or watching.
Thank you.
Please continue to support this podcast. Please subscribe, and you'll have lots of wonderful more episodes with some wonderful guests like Steven. And thank you so much. Till we speak again.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.